amazing. I have been looking for someone to do PR for me, and I think I've just found them. Who knew? Who knew that Paul was so adept at public relations? That was a lovely intro. Thanks very much. I think that Paul did get to a couple of things. Redmonk is an industry analyst company, and you may, you probably have your views about the Gartners and Forresters of this world. We do things a little bit differently at Redmonk in that we don't just track purchasing. We try and understand the world through the lens of the practitioner, the makers, the doers, that are people that are actually building the applications. When we launched the business in 2002, we were kind of outliers because we were saying things like developers are really important and you need to understand open source because they're the people that are driving this. And there was a lot of skepticism about that. But in the intervening years, as we've seen the cloud take off, driven by developers, as we've seen open source just become absolutely the way things are done, driven by developers, as we've seen the App Store revolution, driven by developers, as we've seen the total collapse of Nokia, driven by the fact it didn't have any developers. Our kind of way of seeing the world has become a little bit more acceptable, a little bit less weird, and we kind of strangely find ourselves somewhat in the mainstream. So it turns out that software developers are reaching a kind of primacy. I talked to some of the people here yesterday, and it was very interesting to me that I think a lot of you here are disruptors. You're disruptive people within your organization. There may be some people in the organization that are doing things the old ways. You're trying to find new ways of doing things, and that's one of the reasons you're gravitating to platforms such as WSO2, because it instantiates some of these things. It is open source. You could just try it. You can just download it. You don't have to ask for permission. So that's the world that we try and understand. Web and open source culture, I think, is interesting because, I grew up, came out of the enterprise. I came into the business in 1995. I started with mainframes. That was my world. I was kind of the youngest guy on the team at the time. They said, oh, all that stuff is going away, all that legacy stuff, so we'll give it to the junior reporter. And then they called me Legacy Boy throughout the 90s. Oh, you do MVS, okay, we'll give you VMS. And so I've gone through this journey, and the key thing about the way Redmonk does things slightly differently is, look, I'll announce before we start, I make money from vendors, but on the other hand, it's the developers that keep us honest. And if we lose them, we lose everything. So, software is eating the world. Have any of you read this piece in the Wall Street Journal? Good, we have one by Paul Andreessen. Okay, let's see. How good was the party last night? Do you know who Paul Andreessen is? Was that? Did I say Paul Andreessen? Yeah, that makes things a little bit harder. Perhaps I had a party last night. Mark Andreessen. Okay, so Netscape in 1995 kind of kicked off this internet revolution. And Andreessen was the guy behind that. And he's now an investor of some note. And he wrote an essay called Software is Eating the World from the perspective that, and the VC firm is Andreessen Horowitz, that sort of the first wave of the internet was not as significant as we might have thought. I mean, we've got a new retailer, we've got Amazon, but and obviously it's disrupting in terms of its cloud business. But have we really substantially and fundamentally changed the way we do business? Today we are. So Uber is an interesting company that's come out, and it turns out that it's not just startups that are disruptive, sometimes the cabs are disruptive. So as Europeans, many of you, did you in your cities have some disruption a couple of weeks ago? Taxis complaining about this new web application and business? And hotels as well. So Airbnb has kind of emerged really quickly. It was interesting to me. Airbnb is basically a service that you can take your flat or apartment and let people use that. And I kind of call this the sharing economy. And I thought it was interesting because I would see about Airbnb on the internet, as Paul says. I spend a lot of time on Twitter, and people would be using this service. And then one day my wife comes up to me and she says, yeah, so one of our friends is moving out of our house for 2 weeks and staying with friends because she's rented her house out on Airbnb. She did this first in the Olympics, and now she does it regularly. So you've got someone living in an area of London that's getting more expensive, and the way she pays and can afford to live there is that she's putting her house on Airbnb. And so hotels around the world are now turning around and saying, well, actually, this is a substantive threat for us. So we've got transportation worrying about this. You've got hotels worrying about this. It's pretty clear that we're reaching a new period of disruption in business. And I think that from our perspective, what we found really interesting was when I came into this business, if I went to JP Morgan and started talking to them about IT, the first question would be, can you help us be more like Goldman Sachs? That was the thing. We need to be more like our peers. Today, if you go in and talk to them, they're like, can you help us understand how we can do storage more like Facebook does? And I think that's a really profound shift. And alongside this, tech is really fragmenting at the moment. So in the 90s when I started, and I think, I'm not going to, I don't know how old you are, it was Oracle, and it was Java, and it was .NET, and we knew what the world looked like. It was very clear which platforms. It was going to be one of a couple of platforms, and everything seemed to be becoming more and more consolidated. I remember Steve Mills, who ran software for IBM. Now he runs software and hardware. And he stood there and explicitly said in front of a group full of analysts, oh, Java's the last programming language we'll ever need. He was wrong, of course. We've seen a ton of language innovation of late. So yeah, sure, on top of the Java virtual machine, we've now got language like Scala, JRuby. We've seen Ruby as something that's had an explosive impact on the build-out on the web because of the Rails framework. We've seen this change where, Derek Collison, who built the Cloud Foundry platform as a service, he stood up and he was like, Ruby is absolutely the best way to do all this stuff. Do everything in Ruby. Built Cloud Foundry in Ruby, and then within 18 months turned around and said, Ruby sucks. The only way to build infrastructure is using Go. We're going to use Go. All DevOps will be built in Go from now on. So these language choices, and then database. It's kind of boiling down to, you might be going with SQL Server, you might be going with Oracle, and of course now we've got this whole NoSQL movement. Yesterday I noticed, I couldn't tell whether it was a dog whistle or something explicit, but clearly there have been a couple of choices that WSO2 has made. We kept hearing Mongo. That's a database that, it wasn't used by the enterprise 5 years ago. It certainly is now. Again, that was a phenomenon driven by West Coast developers. So databases are fragmenting. The kinds of tools we use for managed applications, there are a lot more choices than we had. And one of the implications of this is that we do need to have engineering involved in decision making. We do need to listen to the developers, the new kingmakers. They are going to make the right choices. We can't just leave tech choices to legal and financial and procurement. You will get left behind if you're not taking advantage of some of this stuff, but of course you don't want to make the wrong choices. So we've got all of these kinds of tools we can use. Polyglot is a term that's often used. Some of you are probably polyglot. I certainly heard Isabel using a few languages yesterday, which was quite impressive. But it doesn't matter what part of IT you're currently using, the chances are is that you've got new choices that you hadn't considered and didn't know about. So Redmonk, again, one of the ways we do research, we don't believe that surveys works very well, because if you ask elite developers why and how they make particular tech choices, they're not going to answer a survey. So I notice actually this is looking a little bit blurry, which is quite unhelpful at scale. But what we do, rather than surveying, is that we look at the behaviors of people in the communities where they live. So this is basically a plot of check-ins to GitHub against Stack Overflow conversations and the tags. And there are some issues in the methodology. I mean, JavaScript tends to find itself, because of the nature of the libraries used in many projects, so it's ranked slightly more highly. But we've been tracking programming languages for a few quarters now. This was initially from a guy called Drew Conway. We completely stole this model, and he's quite happy with that. But what we found is just that in terms of tiering, you've got up here Java, JavaScript, and PHP. They are continuing to show significant strength as top-tier languages. Ruby's up there, Objective-C. And the second tier, again, you've got Visual Basic, you've got all the stuff that's still being used. Basically, there's a fair degree of fragmentation, and that's driven by the developer choices. Again, Objective-C is because of Apple. But I think one of the interesting things is just the position of Java. Because I kept hearing my sort of other colleagues at other firms saying that Java was dead. Have you heard that Java's dead? You use it every day, but apparently it's dead. As somebody that started in the mainframe, and the mainframe isn't dead, I think dead just means it's in production. So Java's actually kind of weirdly going through quite a renaissance at the moment. And trying to understand what that is, I mean, there's a couple of things. One would be that Android is Java, just without paying Oracle any license fees, which is OK. And the other one would be big data. I think this is one of the very interesting phenomenons that I see, is that a lot of I remember Tim Bray, and it was funny because at the time, he worked, he was one of the creators of XML and worked at Google for a while on the Android team. And he wrote this piece about how there was no innovation in Java. All the cool stuff was happening in Ruby. And I kind of looked, and it's like, all these crappy apps built in Rails. What's so cool about that? At the same time, Yahoo was making the choice, because of engineering decisions, to build Hadoop in Java. And you kind of say, well, yeah, OK, that's one application. Well, what else is there? You know, the other companies were saying, we're not going to do Java. So Facebook was no, we're all about PHP. We're not going to be doing Java. And then they said, oh, actually, Hadoop is really good, so we're going to start using Hadoop. And now they're making choices such as say, well, OK, Hadoop is really good, so when we need a graph database, we're going to choose Giraffe. That's based on Java. And Facebook is now one of the biggest Java shops on the planet. Twitter. They started building in Ruby. Interesting decision. Ran into a bunch of scaling problems. And as their business has changed, it's become very apparent that they needed a different infrastructure. So they went with the JVM, so the Java Virtual Machine. And in terms of the traffic spikes that they find, what's interesting is it's no longer traffic spikes. Now it's just ongoing and constant throughput. So during the US election, the kinds of things that used to make Twitter fall over didn't do that anymore. So who here is on Twitter? Do you use Twitter? One, two, a few. Most of you have jobs, so you don't waste your time on stuff like that. So for me, I used to like it when Twitter fell over, because I could concentrate and actually think about stuff. I was like, oh, good, the fail whale. Twitter is down. So did you ever see the fail whale? So that was this symbol that came up when Twitter, the system, sort of fell over. And what's interesting to me is the users were celebrating downtime. You know, we all grew up with this idea everything needed to be 5 nines, and yet everybody had fail whales on their T-shirt. So the people that were interested in this service were saying something interesting, I think, about reliability and scale. But the bottom line is, when web companies grow up, they turn into Java shops. That is not to say that they're not using a lot of other software. They're not choosing one language. It is many languages on the JVM. They are doing a lot of integration. They're taking different approaches. And it's that polyglot approach. They're going to use different tools for different jobs. In the enterprise, we've been too reductionist. We're like, oh, here is the database. We're going to put everything in Oracle, which is kind of fine, but it's rather expensive, and sometimes that's not the best tool for the job. Accelerating innovation. So, you know, whether or not you think startups are actually innovative, this is really interesting. Chris Tacey put this together, and you're looking at number of deals against deal size. And so from 2001, we had the crash. And then something interesting happened, which is that the deals started creeping up, and the deal size started creeping up again. Because back in the 90s, when we had startups, it was kind of like, oh yeah, you'd go to a VC, and you'd start, and you'd say, we need $50 million. And the VC would say, that is absolutely correct. Because you need to spend $10 million on EMC for storage, you need to spend $10 million on WebLogic for application server, you need to spend $10 million on database. 10 million on network and 10 million on marketing, and then you'll be ready to go. This was kind of a different model. The deal size was going up, and then suddenly, mid-2006, something really interesting happened. And there was a big disjunction in number of companies formed and the cost of doing and creating those companies. So what do you think happened in 2006? That's right, it was Paul and... No, just kidding. So, any ideas? Sorry? Amazon Web Services. The creation of Amazon Web Services, the delivery of that completely changed the game for how startups were built. And let's see. So we've got the Amazon answer, which is good. But something else happened, because it's one thing to have infrastructure, but you also need something to industrialize the process. So what else happened at that time to take advantage of this new infrastructure from Amazon Web Services? Any ideas? Sorry? iPhone, no? Accelerators. So the creation of Y Combinator came out and realized that because of this lower cost, they could industrialize the model of startups. And they built a program where startups would come in, they'd give them a certain size of the certain chunk of the company, not as much as traditional VCs. They would get them started, get them out to market, and it was just, get them through the process, get the companies launched, and then get them funded afterwards. And so we saw this significant disjunction. And what's interesting for me is if that's what happened in Silicon Valley, what's happening in the enterprise? We've got access to Amazon Web Services, but what's going to be the accelerator? How are we going to be set up so that we can have more flowers bloom? And how do we choose the right flowers and support them so that we can have more effective businesses? Because clearly we can't all be building kind of, apps to track our pets, whatever the thing it is. A lot of that is rubbish, but some of that has value. Permission-based development. So yeah, we used to have to ask for all of this stuff. Engineering had to go and ask permission. If you wanted to make a project, you had to go and find the finance in order that you could actually deliver something. And normally that would be coming from IT. They kept a close hold of those purse strings. If it was coming from the business, it had to go from the business to IT. Then IT would kind of decide. IT was the arbiter. Obviously the lines of business were making their own choices. They were buying applications. We began to see this, I think, was interesting with Salesforce, because you could go in and say to organizations, so do you use the cloud? No, we don't use the cloud. And then it would turn out that the sales organization had been using Salesforce for a long time. So we moved out of this era of needing permission. So what was really expensive infrastructure, we can now get in the cloud. We can get compute and storage. And it's extraordinary, the price curves that we're currently on. So Amazon at the moment is kind of 6 times ahead of Moore's Law in terms of reduction of cost of infrastructure. They're driving the cost of infrastructure down really quickly, and that was even before Google began to really put the pressure on them in terms of a price war. So we've got Google and Amazon in a big price war around infrastructure, whether that's compute, network, storage, and so on. And there's all sorts of interesting stuff you can do. I mean, global load balancing across a single IP, very impressive technology. From a software perspective, look, it's all out there. It's open source. Organizations that are not using open source are clearly a competitive disadvantage. So there's been a transition. We used to have to ask the banks. Crowdfunding is amazing. I mean, if you haven't looked at Kickstarter, check it out, because it's a little bit addictive. But it's really interesting, the projects that get funded. Paul mentioned this project that we did wanting to open a community space. And, for me, it was actually pretty staggering that we raised £90,000 in 30 days in order to open an event space. That's not an interesting Kickstarter, but it was very addictive, let me tell you. What is interesting is what we're seeing in terms of open source. I believe there's been more than $500 million raised on Kickstarter alone to fund open source hardware startups. So crowdfunding is a really effective model, and surprising the amount of impact it's making. Have you all heard about Oculus Rift? Oculus Rift is this incredibly immersive technology. It's kind of the virtual reality thing that William Gibson promised us. And obviously there's a bit of a nightmare scenario in all of this. And in this case, the nightmare scenario is Facebook bought them. So Facebook is going to control our augmented reality. That sounds like a bad idea to me, but the simple fact is they went from a Kickstarter to being bought for hundreds of millions of dollars in a very short space of time. They didn't have to go out and get funding from someone else. They didn't have to ask for permission. VCs, you know, we still think, oh yeah, VCs, they're the guys that actually are in control of this. They're under pressure because the accelerators have come along and said, look, we don't actually need your level of involvement. We can turn something around, get it moving fast. We do not need to even ask the VCs for permission. That's not to say that VCs aren't still messing a bunch of stuff up, but there you go. In some cases, they're creating a huge amount of value. There's also sort of this disintermediation. Yeah, before you had to be in a company if you wanted to build something, if you wanted to have people around you that could help you be effective. We're now kind of seeing co-working in the clusters. And if you look at San Francisco, there's just this sort of shared language and understanding of how to get stuff done that is tremendously powerful and historically at least seemed to be more about companies. It's a bit more like the way guilds used to act. R&D labs, sure. Who can afford those? Well, now we're seeing makerspaces. The Hackspace in London has just done a crowdfunding. You can go there. They've got everything from lathes to 3D printers to anything you would want in order to make a product or prototype. And finally, I don't want to go too far down this you don't need to go to university line. I think Peter Thiel is a bit of... Peter Thiel is a very rich man, so he's got some things right. But the idea that university is bad, I don't agree with. However, there's clearly a huge amount of knowledge on the internet that enables us to get stuff done in a way that we couldn't before. And this has been, I think sometimes we forget just how substantive this is. That I can just, anytime I need to know about any complex, could be about, you've got 15-year-old kids finding new cancer cures because they just went and did the research across 2 different areas on the internet, which is frankly staggering to me. And, I don't know, I guess we're all screwed because the 16-year-olds are way smarter than we ever were at that age and are now. So the developer strikes back. Developers have done some land grabs. So developers said, oh, waterfall really sucks. Why do we have to keep doing this? And so they started doing Agile. Developers said, shit, I really hate the DBA. So they went and started using NoSQL databases. Developers are making choices, and they're not called hackers for nothing, right? They'll find ways, better ways of doing things. And so across a number of areas, the accepted, oh yeah, we'll do this sorts of approaches are falling down. And smart organizations are understanding that this makes sense. So, we used to be sort of farmers. We had this back-breaking work called enterprise development, and we had our Java shovel every day, and we're shoveling away, and we're in our cubicle or a little farm, and we would put up these fences around our IT infrastructure and our customers, and keep them in place and manage the environment and be in control of it, and that was fine. But now we've kind of moved into a more sort of foraging approach. There's all this fragmentation, there's all this beautiful stuff out there, there's all these opportunities, so let's go and put our head up and find out what's up there and start using that to make more effective business outcomes. Sort of transition from a farming to a foraging metaphor, and GitHub is the best implementation of this. So who here has checked code into GitHub? That's quite a decent number. Who here has looked at GitHub at other people's code? Same group, not much difference. If you're not familiar with GitHub, get familiar with GitHub. It's very interesting to me. I talk about the internet as a place of knowledge. It's kind of, it's many things. One of them is kind of a Facebook for developers. So you can just basically go and follow the best developers on the planet and look at the code they're writing, look at the problems they're trying to solve, and learn from them. That sort of degree of pedagogy is really quite impressive. But it's also just a great way of building code today. So Git is interesting. I talked about fragmentation. We used to be shit scared of fragmentation in IT. The worst thing that could happen was fragmentation. Oh no, the Unix wars. Oh, Unix has fragmented. Now we're really in trouble. Oh no. You know, we're going to go back to the mini computer times. But actually, Unix was a big step forward. And it turns out that, Linus Torvalds, amazing, because like Linux completely changed the game. Social revolution in how IT is done. And then he went and created this thing called Git, which may be even more significant. Because the issue he had was, how do I manage everybody's check-in to Linux? They need to be able to go and work on Linux. We've got Linux, and they need to be able to go away, write stuff, and I need to be able to resolve all of this stuff. And Git is basically a tool that enables you to fork code and then hopefully resolve the code. The resolve is the harder bit. There are tools like Gerrit and so on. GitHub just was an interface for Git that didn't completely suck. And so people were like, I'm just going to put my code there. I'm going to put my code there. And in fact, we've even gone into kind of what I call POS, post-open source code. You've got young developers today, and they don't give a shit what the license is. They just write JavaScript and then put it on GitHub. It's done. And, you know, down the line, somebody is going to use that code, and there's going to be some IP issues, possibly. But the simple fact is this is a default now for a lot of coders. There's a ton of good technology up there, so I was, well, you know, perhaps I shouldn't comment on what Cisco is doing, but there's a certain Mr. Martini that might be doing stuff in GitHub. Agile and continuous deployment. I said about this developer land grab, you know, the web has definitely improved the state of the art for application development, and we should learn from that. Because all of us have been involved with IT failures, or at least what are called failures. We didn't deliver on time, or we didn't deliver quite as expected. Agile's kind of changed that. And sure, it didn't all happen on the web. I mean, the original kind of gang of four and so on looking at this weren't from the web, but the people that made this work at scale were web companies. Programmable web is a really interesting site. I envy their data, and they're lucky enough to let people share and use it. I just wanted to point out this growth in web APIs, because one of the big things about this talk is integration and pulling together all of this stuff. We're just seeing more and more APIs. So API discovery and management and understanding just becomes ever more important in this fragmenting world, and developers are driving this. One of the things that we've seen really clearly at Redmonk, we just saw the collapse of SOAP web services in terms of developer choices, and we saw organizations turning around and deprecating their SOAP APIs because nobody was using them. You know, that was where the reason why we're using REST interfaces today is because developers decided that was a better way of doing things. But this is going to require a lot of management at scale. So infrastructure as code, I think, again, fragmentation to me is interesting because traditionally, so you've all heard of Puppet Labs, right? Puppet for automation. Probably heard of Chef. And sure, in IT, we're going to go to a two-horse race. We've got Chef and Puppet. We don't need to worry about anything else. We've made our choice. That's it. CF Engine's been around for a while, but what was interesting to us at Redmonk was that we suddenly saw the rise of SaltStack and Ansible works. It's like, wait, wasn't two enough? But there are actually more DevOps automation tools being created all the time. And we've certainly seen really interesting community engagement on the networks that we track around SaltStack and Ansible. So the fragmentation seems to be increasing. We're not actually seeing fewer things. We're seeing more and more things being created, more difficult things for you to manage. We've got to borrow from web companies in how we do stuff and the code they write, because frankly, they're pretty good software engineers. I mean, the traditional software companies obviously do a pretty good job of writing code. Although, wait, did I just say that? Okay, some traditional enterprise software companies do a pretty decent job of writing code. No, do you mind? Pretty good job of writing code. But these do as well. So, you know, if we look at Yahoo and the creation of Hadoop, Hadoop has been, is making a huge impact on organizations and the way they manage data. Again, I mentioned Oracle and putting all your data into Oracle as a common repository. It now seems that like Hadoop is playing that role. If you look at the kinds of things that Salesforce is doing, you know, at the moment they rely on Oracle, and that's not a good place to be for them. They're investing really heavily in Hadoop as an alternative, and we're certainly seeing enterprises across the board say, wait, why do we need the traditional data warehousing approaches? Why do we need these databases, relational databases, if the data is not appropriate? Etsy is really, really good at deploying application changes to production code. And they share everything about how they do it. You can follow the Etsy tech blogs, and it's amazing. I mean, if you want to know how to run infrastructure at scale, they will tell you. Netflix, obviously pretty good at delivering services at scale as well, although not always on Christmas Day. But what they learned and what they do is they built a thing called Chaos Monkey, which is interesting because their view is that things are bound to fail. So they built a tool that goes in and breaks your infrastructure on purpose. Because when you're writing an application, that's the way you should test it. Things are going to go wrong. But what's interesting is they just gave the code over. The first enterprise company that seems to be embracing and adopting that is IBM. They're actually building Chaos Monkey into product offerings. Twitter is delivering a ton of interesting high-scale technology. So if you want to understand what the sort of web operating system is going to look like, interesting enough, it seems that Greek is now the language for naming stuff. So look up Project Mesos and Project Kubernetes, which came last week from Google. Google had not been providing as much. So have we got any Greeks here? Maybe you can tell us what those words mean. I know we have one, Yorgos, here, so Yorgos is here. Google is now providing technology in the way the others do. What's interesting in terms of technology is we started with the hardware is where the value is, then went into the software is where the value is. Then Google was like, the software is not really valuable, we're not going to share back. But now all of these companies are contributing code, and in data management, a lot of that is really powerful. So just learn from them. I think that's the bottom line, that the enterprise and the web are not so different anymore. There's a huge convergence at work, and if they're going to share, why not take that stuff and use it? Bit of a gear change here. So what else are these companies providing? One of the things is this notion of wearable computing, and sort of moving into this notion of the Internet of Things. Google is moving ahead with the notion of watches and other stuff that we can wear. That is, well, it's going to be awesome because we get to have a watch again. We thought we'd got rid of it, but it's coming back. So we've got the Google Glass, which, they are shocking things. I'm sure you've seen, or I hope you haven't, I don't even want to describe it, but it's burned in my mind, so you can have it too. There's a guy called Robert Scoble. He's actually a really bright guy. And as soon as he got his glasses, what did he do? Took a picture of himself in the shower and shared it. Thanks, dude. One thing I never needed to see. Don't look it up on the internet because you won't be able to forget it. So we got the glass holes. And, it's easy to be very skeptical. Nobody's ever going to do this. This is rubbish. This is not going to be useful. But then I know a guy that's doing an agriculture startup, and he figures that farmers could wear a glass that would enable them to understand better what they're doing on an ongoing basis. And also, everybody said that Twitter sucked and it would never take off. The stuff we laugh, basically, if we laugh at Scoble, in 5 years, we'll all be doing it. So, and it doesn't have to look like that. You start to think, well, once they get the fashion side sorted, once we're in a position where women have realized, hey, this is something that I want as well. Once we're in a position that this becomes more mainstream, and this is happening quite quickly, we're having fashion shows, pretty clearly the Google glasses look like crap. We put them in a pair of Ray-Bans or something, and we've seen this in sporting, in sports. So, people that are really good at skiing, there are some interesting things they've been doing with similar sorts of technology. And, do we really need to be able to have a thing that will enable us to remember everyone's names? I don't know if this is a good thing. I used to remember phone numbers. Now I don't remember any phone numbers. I remember a few people's names. In a couple of years, I probably won't, because I'll be wearing these bloody things. But there are likely to be some really interesting applications, and we're going to have to build apps for them, and that's going to mean a lot of integration. Quantified self, I don't know if you've come across that as a term. Quantified self is just this notion that you can track what you're doing in order to be happier, healthier, wiser, whatever it is. There are some really interesting startups in Europe now. I mean, track your blood sugar. Obviously, that's really important. Diabetes is a hugely expensive thing. It's a huge issue for people with the condition, and being able to manage that is interesting. And to me, the fact that we're moving from something that started with nerds, quantified self, is now becoming something that healthcare companies are beginning to understand and they need to invest in. I talk about software is eating the world. They put angry birds through clinical trials, and apparently that is as good at preventing depression as a lot of the drugs that the pharma companies are currently putting forward. So there's all sorts of interesting things, and certainly this notion that I can be wearing something that knows how many steps I take, you know, going forward, kind of what I've eaten, just helping me to be more healthy, hopefully is going to lead to good outcomes. Again, all kinds of mad integration going on there. Because, you know, it's one thing to be wearing a bracelet, but we're going to be starting, people with conditions that can be mediated are going to start injecting tiny things into themselves, or their doctors will hopefully do that, in order to manage and monitor their medical conditions. And, you know, to be more prosaic, what is this mobile first? I know you've all heard the term. I think Luke Roblensky is the guy that originally put it forward. To me, the real key behind all of this about mobile first is it's about putting the user or the individual first. It's not about what the business can provide. It's like, how do we reconstitute our services to better suit this individual, whether they're wearing a Fitbit or whatever it is. And that's a big change in how we develop apps. And again, that requires a lot of integration capabilities because there's so many more things that we can do. I mean, they mentioned, you know, location information from the GPS and so on. And also in mobile development, it's really hard because it's swinging back and forth so fast. As an industry analyst, like, well, you know, everybody's like, yeah, everything is going to be hybrid. Hybrid is the way forward. And everyone's like, no, everything is going to be native. And we talk to organizations and it's moving back and forth. You know, you and you've all got people in your businesses and they will be saying it has to be native. It has to be on the iPad. And someone, no, it's much better if it's cross-platform. It's really hard to make the decisions. It seems like the pendulum is swinging really fast. Developers have to be able to respond to that. Design-led. One of the things we've seen is pretty, and it was interesting. I asked a question yesterday about API design, and I'm not sure I asked it properly because the simple fact that this mobile-first, this user-first revolution means that it's no good just being a developer. You've got to include some design skills in your organization. They may be hard to hire. A good example is GDS, the Government Digital Service in the UK. So they're currently, the UK government in its infinite wisdom realized that spending billions of pounds a year on failed IT projects was not a good idea. And every IT project like that failed. I mean, pretty much. It would be, oh yeah, we're going to have a completely new tax system, and then 5 years in, and £1 billion, and they'd say, oh no, actually, that didn't work. So they've created an organization that's going to make them more effective, and that's designers, developers, and practitioners, and they're not just building systems, they're there to change procurement, legal, and everything else. Because the idea is that you've got to be introducing these new disciplines, understanding user experience and so on, if you want to have better results. And all of these things come together. I mean, I thought that the world was slowing down a bit, and as an industry analyst, I would have to track less stuff. It's all accelerating. I mean, I'm sure you're seeing this. New things you need to support, and you're going to need tools that enable you to deal with this fragmentation. So just one thing drives another. More user experience means we need more cloud, means we need more social, means we need more SOA, and so on. The rise of microservices, so this is the hip term that I haven't heard the WSO2 crowd use yet. You will be using this. It's this meme that suddenly popped up, Martin Fowler. And we've seen this. I mean, it used to be, one of the things we heard a lot of in these new web services was, oh, that's not a product, that's a feature. When Twitter came out, that's not a product, that's a feature. Lots of that going on. In the enterprise, we're kind of, or at scale, we're seeing this with things like, any of you use SendGrid as a mail API? It's one thing. All it does is mail. That was all they wanted to provide, was mail. They don't do anything else. They just send mail. And it's this notion that actually we really do need to be making decisions that enable us to decompose apps. I mean, look, it's SOA kind of without the XML garbage. So it's just this notion of decomposing services. And microservices, see, it's a meme, so it's got its own cool Greek character. I told you Greek is definitely, we're seeing more of it in tech memes at the moment. Have any of you read the essay by Steve Yegge, who worked at Amazon? Check it out. It's there we go. I'm bringing someone with me on this journey at least, which is great. I just think it's very interesting that we imagine that, oh, this Amazon cloud stuff just happened. They just went and built something and it was useful. To me, what's interesting is Amazon is the single best realized SOA on the planet, and that is why they were able to do Amazon Web Services. And it came out of a top-down mandate, not driven by developers, but driven by Jeff Bezos. He knew that if Amazon was not an SOA, that they weren't going to be able to succeed. And these rules are really very, very, when you look at them, this is the way we sort of know we should be running the organization, but we don't do it. I think that probably the important thing in making it stick was this, and following up, because he meant it. And he had a guy there that would go in, and if people were using interfaces that could not be publicly published, they would be fired. It was simple as that. So Amazon, this stuff doesn't happen by accident. And so the notion of microservices, and it doesn't matter which particular technology you use, but as we all begin to do stuff like this, again, far more stuff needs to be integrated. API management is the new SOA. This is how we manage this stuff. When we look at API management, it is basically the SOA concepts. So they're coming together. And the API management investments you make are obviously going to be relevant to microservices, because microservices really are APIs. Cloud first. We kind of know about this stuff, but the important thing, I think, is to start doing SOA the way that the cloud does it, and learn from that, learn from the web companies. And in terms of hiring, to me, the most interesting thing when I talked to Mark at ING about what they did was it's hiring people that want to make a change. And that was what I met yesterday when I met some of you. A lot of you want to drive this change. Maybe you should get jobs at ING. There is a different mindset in terms of driving this change. Social first. People are things as well. It's very interesting to me. What do people do? They do searches on Google. The Bank of England now uses Google searches to track and understand future changes in house prices. We're in an environment where kind of we are the sensors and we're creating the interesting data. And when the Bank of England is kind of doing that, I mean, they're a pretty traditional organization, right? Oh, I think that's come twice. It was so important that you learn to borrow and learn from web companies that I told you twice. Many buyers, that's changed. And the tolerance has really changed in terms of well, why can't we have this stuff? Why can't we have our own device? Why can't I have this? And all of these things basically say, I'm going to choose something, and you're going to have to integrate it into the organization. That's what these buyers are asking for. I had the thing about people as sensors. Geoffrey Moore has this transactions, he talks about systems of record against systems of engagement. And the key for me is just that what is a transaction? It used to be a database lock, a database commit. It isn't anymore. Social transactions are just as relevant, are likely to create just as much value for the organization. Perhaps you don't need to scale to 5 nines of availability. Perhaps there's something else you should be optimizing for. And finally, this world of context. This is where Scoble does good work, not in the shower, but in his thinking. And he talks about the age of context. And for me, when you look at an application like Uber and you begin to tie all this together where They know where you are. You know where they are. This is a day when they did a marketing initiative to just deliver cats to people if they wanted them. But we're moving beyond the idea that we can just know where someone is and know how fast they're moving and everything else. iOS is moving through with an emotion recognition API. So you can actually begin to know how pissed off your customer is. So we're really moving forward where it is about sentiment. We've got all of this stuff that needs to be done, all of this stuff that we can take advantage of, all of this data that you can bring into your organization to make it more effective. Okay, good. You guys have seen that meme then. So yeah, SOA, huge role to play. SOA is not dead. It's just in production. There are these lessons, and we need to be working with companies that understand the value of what's happening on the web. SOA underpins API management. That's going to go now into microservices. More fragmentation, more stuff needs to be pulled together. And scale is an interesting one because, I mentioned this Internet of Things. And honestly, I spent a lot of time before this trying to find the right numbers to tell you in order that you understand, how many orders of magnitude more data we're going to deal with and everything else. But you know all that. We're seeing it every day. We're kind of living it. And I couldn't find the one compelling data point that would make it. But environmental monitoring, sensors everywhere, machines with a huge range of sensors they didn't used to have. I think my favorite example is, did you know that when trains travel, the wheels go out of round? They go slightly out of round, and they go a bit oblong, and that makes the track need more maintenance, and that needs more work from your maintenance. So, of course, what do? You start instrumenting the train wheels. And in fact, anything that spins, anything that gets hot will be instrumented. We're seeing wind turbines. Of course, they'll be instrumented. But anything that spins, washing machines and all of that, the classic internet sort of fridge, which I still don't think is going to be a thing. But, hey, I've been wrong plenty of times before. So the world is changing really fast, the end of permission. And I think the thing that I find most interesting is I used to have to deal with kind of the object wars and stuff, and object models and COM and Corba, and it was all really horrible. I think that we've got a lot better at integration. And that's a good thing because we've got massive, massive challenges ahead. So we need to choose the right platforms that enables us to deal with those challenges. And I think that is a wrap. Thank you. So we started, I think, 4 minutes late, and I went over by 2 minutes and 59 seconds. We can take some questions. But I would love to take some questions as long as they're about Coca-Cola and Mentos.
So I'm going to ask a question.
Did you start with a joke? So,
Is it working? Okay. I'm going to ask a question for your crystal ball. You might have seen the latest HP announcement about a completely new architecture with new OS, new processing. Having come from the mainframe world myself as well, what do you think the chances are for this to actually go anywhere?
Wow. Well, the first thing is it comes from HP. So the thing about HP is that they haven't shown a great deal of stickiness to the task. We talk on the web about failing fast. HP seems to love to do that. They also, I'm being really brutal. They also, I think that HP has really moved away from being a company that develops its own technology. I mean, it was just an incredible powerhouse of new inventions. And it was kind of really depressing to me that they became a company that bought everything and gave it away. Whether it was giving a database again to, wow, Oracle is taking a kicking from me today, but taking a database, give that to Oracle. Oh yeah, don't worry, we don't like the proprietary stuff, but that just meant that they turned into a kind of a body shop. And I would love to see that culture change, and I would love to see them do something really fundamental in terms of changing the way we do things. And certainly, storage, the tail is wagging the dog, and they should be looking at storage computers. So, I think that it's an interesting idea, but I think the jury's really out, because I don't know, how long the CEO will last, how long that current management team will last, or whatever. I mean, currently they're on, I think, the third cut of their cloud story, and that's largely about commodity stuff. So it's really difficult to do commodity well and the optimized system stuff well. It's a really interesting area. I mean, I look at yesterday, Microsoft, the Bing folks announced they're going to start using field programmable gateways to improve the performance of search. Amazon has now hired a chip engineering team. They hired what was Calxeda. So you've got Amazon buying chip designers. They're never going to sell chips, but they just want more performance. And so I think HP will find some areas where that technology will be applied, but I don't think we're going to have some fundamental new computing model based on that. But, perhaps I'm very wrong. Anyone else? Yeah, there's a couple of questions in the back there. These lights are really bright, by the way. Really bright.
Hey, yeah, right.
Hey.
I'm here. The commercial companies, right, they are feeding the...
In fact, could you just turn the lights down a teeny bit? I'm sure you don't need to see me anymore. Go ahead, sorry.
I think they don't want you to see who's asking the question.
Okay. I'll just listen then.
Okay. So the commercial companies are feeling the onslaught, right? The open source is eating their business. So do you think there's going to be a fight back, like the Score story earlier, during the Linux time?
So do I think that open source is having a significant impact? Do I think that
the commercial companies are going to fight back?
No, I don't think they are. I mean, no, open source is just how we do things now. Everybody does it. So, if we look at Microsoft, they've been, over the past couple of years, one of the biggest contributors to the Linux kernel because they want to advantage their virtualization technology. So, what they called a cancer 10 years ago is now part of their business operations. When we look at the technology, as I said, being delivered by the web companies, you're just putting yourself at such competitive disadvantage if you don't embrace that stuff. I mean, it's no accident that every data management company in the industry right now has a Hadoop story, partly because their customers are asking them, but partly because they frankly are at a significant cost disadvantage if they don't use this stuff. So I think regardless of the business, I mean, I don't see commercial as antithetical to open source, and I also believe that, sometimes it is just a consumption activity. Apple is not the best open source citizen out there. However, a lot of you have Macs. It's based on FreeBSD. So it's built on open source foundations. They're not at a competitive disadvantage. You don't have to open source everything, but you've got to be really incredible to, I mean, one of the things that we're seeing from enterprise organizations today is they really do expect to see the code. They expect to be able to see the code. So I think that I don't think we can put Pandora back in the box. This is a better economic model. It's a better engineering model. It's a better way of doing manufacturing, and I don't see that we'd somehow stop doing open source. Was that the question?
Right. Yeah. So there was this copyright infringement lawsuit that Google failed for their Android Java interfaces against Oracle. recently? You know that?
Well, yeah, I mean, I guess in Google's perspective, they had enough money to fight the case, which helps. If they had have still just been Dalvik, it would have been much more of a problem. But in fact, it's still, the jury is still out. We've had the appeal. I personally think the idea of being able to copyright an API is a really bad thing. I think it shuts down innovation. I think that software patents are a bad thing. They shut down innovation. I don't know if any of you saw the news from Elon Musk this week, but Tesla is giving away all of its patents because I think it's because he wants to get into the battery business, so he needs more people making cars. But it doesn't matter why. The simple fact is he's made the decision that they're keeping or they're opening up their IP. So yeah, I hope, and at the moment, Europe has said you can't copyright APIs, and America's closer to copyrighting them. There's one reason that's a really good thing. We might get more innovators and more work and more cool shit happening in Europe, which I'm happy about. Yes?
Quick one. I saw on a list of things that you listed as disruptive, you didn't mention much about the maker movement. Any?
The maker movement?
Yep.
I think maybe I just didn't do it by name. I had maker spaces, I think, or hack spaces. Yeah, I mean, it's and when Paul talked about what's happening in Shoreditch, where I live and work, or where I work, should I say, it is profound because I don't think we should be passive consumers. We need to be able to, cars that things are getting really weird because like cars that you can't fix unless you have some special automotive stuff. There are plenty of black boxes out there. I don't think we're going to go back to having cars that we actually can fix, but certainly there is stuff getting done in terms of the maker movement. The funding going into there through Kickstarter is just phenomenal. There are various things that I myself have funded now. I think the key there is yeah. I mean, I've got 3 kids, and I don't want them to be passive consumers. I want them to understand that they can make things in the world, and that has to be good. And yes, of course, I mean, some of it's a little bit like, oh, come on. I mean, Facebook has a woodwork shop on site, and you're going to be, really? Is that, who cares? But on the other hand, it's kind of nice that Facebook's engineers can kind of go, you know what? I need to get away from this problem space for a while, and I'm just going to go and make a closet. And who knows? Maybe making that dovetail joint or whatever it is will help them to think better about the interface that they're building or something. But I think it is profound. I mean, the means of production, Marx was a pretty smart guy. We've spent 100 years saying, I say we, red meat eating capitalists have spent 100 years saying he was just a loony. But actually the analysis is pretty sound. And what we are seeing now is we're getting access to the means of production. That's tremendously disruptive. Now the flip side, of course, is that we have power laws. Someone takes the means of production, creates something, and then becomes an evil monopolist. I mean, that keeps happening. Or a don't be evil monopolist, I should say. So, it is going to be profound. It is real. A lot of the Internet of things are not going to come from the big companies. They're going to come from some small outfit that got funded themselves and then became an Oculus Rift. But I have a feeling they will get acquired by a Facebook or whoever it is. So we'll make stuff, and that's great. And we should teach our kids, not just to use PowerPoint, but maybe to do a bit of coding. And so certainly, I'm there with my son, and it's Arduinos and stuff like that. I would just hope that we're all, I seem to keep coming back to kids. I think that's the thing, is just, with all this opportunity, let's unleash their creativity. 16-year-olds curing cancer.
At least in the Valley, I see more people flow through a maker show than both the Google and Apple conferences these days.
Good. Okay, thank you all.